Hey everybody. Alright, so Chapter 6 of Behold the Pale Horse. It is HR 4079 and FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, a tool that can be used to establish the police state. Patriots and taxpayers protest. Patriots and tax protesters. You must never be found at home on any holiday. Your life depends upon how well you can obey that rule. Federal Emergency Management Agency. The following is a transcript of an audio tape with an urgent message to the people from William Cooper on the subject of HR 4079. We must stop the traitors now. William Cooper dictated this information to me by phone earlier in 1990, and I tape recorded the information as he gave it. I made many tapes and sent them out exactly as Mr. Cooper had asked me to do, and those recipients have done the same. My name is Richard Murray, and I believe that William Cooper is the only man in America outside the secret government who truly knows what is happening and what it means to us, the average American citizens. Beginning of the tape. There's a guy by the name of Buster Horton. He's a member of FEMA, and he's a member of the Interdepartmental Unit, which is empowered in the event of a national security emergency to become the unelected national government, a sort of FEMA secret government, so to speak. A pretext for invoking those emergency measures can be found almost daily in the newspapers. It can be anything from the suspension of debt payments by the high bureaus of American countries to mass runs on U.S. commercial banks. And that's an issue, by the way, that's being handled personally by the National Security Council and Brent Scowcroft. To food shortages to the drug war, the whole bit, anything, any disaster emergency declared at all, even including the oil spill from the Exxon tanker in Alaska. If the president had declared a national emergency, that could have triggered it. Any instability in the Middle East, anything, in fact. And they've already tested their capabilities in April of 1984 with Rex 84A, and that was designed to test the readiness of the U.S. civilian and military agencies to respond to a serious national security crisis. Now, the executive order that will implement this, the Executive Order 11051, details responsibilities to the Office of Emergency Planning, or FEMA. It gives authorization to put all executive orders into effect in times of national emergency declared by the President, increased international tension, or economical or financial crisis. Note that it covers every conceivable domestic crisis, but does not even mention war or nuclear attack. Now, the only thing that has to happen for FEMA to be able to implement all the executive orders, emergency executive orders, is for the President to declare a national emergency of any type, as long as it's a national emergency. Executive Order 10995 provides for the takeover of the communications media. Executive Order 10997 provides for the takeover of all electric, power, petroleum, gas, fuels, and minerals. Executive Order 10988 provides for the takeover of food resources and farms. Executive Order 10999 provides for the takeover of all modes of transportation, control of highways, seaports, etc. Executive Order 11000 provides for mobilization of all civilians into work brigades under the government supervision. Executive Order 11001 provides for governmental takeover of all health, education, and welfare programs. Executive Order 11002 designates the Postmaster General to operate a national registration of all persons. Executive Order 11003 provides for the government to take over airports and aircraft. Executive Order 11004 provides for the Housing and Finance Authority to relocate communities, designate areas to be abandoned, and establish new locations for populations. Executive Order 11005 provides for the government to take over railroads, inland waterways, and public storage facilities. Now, all of these were combined under Nixon into one huge executive order, which allows all of this to take place if the president declares a national emergency, and it can be implemented by the head of FEMA, not by the president. The president has already given him that power under these executive orders. All of these were combined into Executive Order 11490, and that was signed by President Carter on July 20th of 1979 and is in fact law. So if HR 4079 is passed and the President does what it says and declares a national emergency because of the drug situation, whether it's for 1 year, 5 years, 5 minutes, or forever, it doesn't make any difference. FEMA then can implement all these executive orders, take over all local, state, and national government, suspend the Constitution, and do whatever they want to do. Now remember what North said during the Iran-Contra hearing. He said that they were prepared to suspend the Constitution of the United States. And he said if it hadn't been for their getting caught, that this would have happened. And all that did was delay it. This is what is still going on, still going to happen, Now they've nominated, and I think he's been appointed, Major General Calvin Franklin, who's the head of FEMA. He was nominated because of discussions proposing the removal of the implementation of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., and Major General Franklin is of the Commanding General of the District of Columbia National Guard. Now, you've got to know that the National Guard would be of no help at all in combating drug traffic in Washington, D.C., or anywhere else. The primary effectiveness of the National Guard is in controlling mass civil disorders. On March 24th, President Bush issued a new executive order delegating to the Director of FEMA powers, which were vested in the President by the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988. And although the order is described by the White House as simply a technical matter, in reality, the revision delegates to the FEMA director direct responsibility for a large number of items which were earlier on the President's prerogative. And that includes responsibility for general federal assistance, the federal emergency assistance, hazard mitigation, individual and family grant programs, and the power to direct other federal agencies to assist in an emergency. And that's the key. All other federal agencies will come under FEMA. Of course, the President retains the power to actually declare an emergency, but as soon as he does that, the implementation of the measures utilized will be transferred directly to the Director of FEMA. The brains behind this contingency plan for a police state were the members of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, both of which Bush is a member. And Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor, who was a member of FEMA's advisory board until he was appointed by Bush to the head National Security Council, is a member of the Trilateral Commission and also a business partner of Henry Kissinger, who has been a traitor to this country for many, many years. And of course, Scowcroft will become the superior to FEMA in the chain of command of the national security emergency when it is declared. The FEMA Advisory Board is dominated by Professor Samuel P. Huntington. In 1978, Huntington drafted for Jimmy Carter Presidential Memorandum 32, which led to the creation of FEMA in 1979. And he's a Harvard professor. He wrote the seminal piece for the Trilateral Commission in the mid-1970s, recommending the democracy and economic development be discarded as outdated ideas. That's nice. He wrote as co-author of the book Crisis in Democracy. We have come to recognize that there are potential desirable limits to economic growth. There are also potentially desirable limits to indefinite extension of political democracy. A government which lacks authority will have little ability short of cataclysmic crisis to impose on its people the sacrifices which may be necessary. All of Huntington's ideas were rewritten into National Security Decision Directive 47, which is in NSDD 47, and that was enacted by President Reagan on July 22nd of 1982. It is identified important areas to be upgraded, such as the nation's industrial base to maintain the national defense, but it nonetheless, and this is very important, laid the groundwork for the secret government's options to institute a police state, and its title is Emergency Mobilization Preparedness. It ordered preparedness measures that involved the waiving or modification of socioeconomic regulations that delay emergency responses and that should receive priority attention. It also specified that preparedness measures that are or may be impeded by legal constraints be identified in the priority task that lays the groundwork for the suspension of the Constitution. Make copies of this tape if you want to. You don't even have to just transcribe it if you don't want to, but get this out to the people. It's important that they understand that if H.R. 4079 is passed, they're history. They won't pass it if we get this out to the people and tell them that this is what they're doing. Most people don't even know about it, and that's the secret government's benefit. If we get this out and tell people what they're doing, then people can get on the phone and then go down and kick their congressman's ass, which is what they should have been doing years ago, and get this thing thrown out of Congress. And the next thing they need to do is throw their congressmen and their senators out of Congress and keep them out of Congress and put their neighbors in there, people they can trust, and keep them in there for only one term. The Constitution is in serious danger. This has nothing to do with the right wing, left wing, or any damn thing. It has to do with the Illuminati taking over this country and joining in the New World Order. When you give this out to people, make sure they agree to make 10 copies and send them to all their friends. End of tape. I decided that transcript of this tape says it all, so why write it again? H.R. 4079. As of this writing, H.R. 4079 is still in committee and has not been subjected to a vote. It is one of the most deceptive and dangerous pieces of legislation to go in front of Congress in many years. It must be stopped at all cost. You must call your representatives and stop the bill. H.R. 4079 has included within its pages 2 provisions that are meant to divert attention from the fact that the bill would declare a state of national emergency for 5 years and would allow FEMA to literally take over local, state, and federal government. This means that the Constitution of the United States could be suspended. The diversions used are terrible if allowed to sneak through. One is a clause that would eliminate the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, and the other would eliminate the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. The diversion would cause heated argument over these two provisions, resulting in some sort of compromise while allowing the declaration of a 5-year state of national emergency to sail right through Congress and become signed into law. If that happens, it's goodbye USA, hello New World Order. Call your congressman and insist that he or she deliver into your hands a complete copy of the H.R. 4079 immediately. Do not take no for an answer. Read it and defeat it. Added before press time. H.R. 4079 may have been secretly passed just as SB 2834 was passed, and H.R. 4079 may be public law 101-647, signed into law by President Bush on November 29, 1990. If this has occurred, then we are already subject to a FEMA takeover. I'm attempting to acquire a copy of PL 101-647. This late-breaking news was furnished by a congressional staff member and has not been verified as of January 8th of 1991. And then he has a whole list of sources. If you would like a copy, feel free to let me know and I'll send you a picture so you can go look at everything that he's referring to. Author's note: the following report by Dr. Pabst concerning FEMA and concentration camps in the United States is photographed and printed exactly as it was rented. In the United States, a national emergency takeover, or total takeover, sorry. This is Dr. William R. Pabst. My address is 713, it's 1434 West Alabama Street, Houston, Texas, 77006. But then it says 713 is out of service. So I would take it that's not the correct area code phone number anymore, because the telephone number is area code 713, but it's out of service, 521-9896. And this is my 1979 updated report on the concentration camp program of the Department of Defense of the United States. On April 20th of 1976, after a rapid and thorough investigation, I filed suit on behalf of the people of the United States against various personages that had a key part in a conspiratorial program to do away with the United States as we know it. This is a progress report to you, the plaintiffs, you, the people of the United States. The civil action number is 76-H-667. It is entitled Complaint Against the Concentration Camp Program of the Department of Defense. It was filed in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas, Houston Division. The judge responsible for the case was Judge Carl Bew. You have no doubt heard the story. Once upon a time, under the Nazi regime in Germany, a man worked on an assembly line in a baby carriage factory. His wife was going to have a baby, but the Nazi government would not let anybody buy a baby carriage. The man decided he would secretly collect one part from each department and assemble the carriage himself. When this was done, he and his wife gathered up the pieces and assembled it. When they were finished, they did not have a baby carriage, they had a machine gun. And that is exactly the situation that I'm going to represent to you at this time. The Center of the Study for Democratic Institutions recently completed a proposed constitution for the new states of America. The center is Rockefeller funded. Not surprising. To give you an indication of the type of constitution proposed, the term national emergency is mentioned 134 times. The document did not have a Bill of Rights, and the right to own arms was taken away. Also not surprising. We'll look around right now, you know. At the same time, House Concurrent Resolution number 28 awaited for calling a constitutional convention on or before July 4th of 1976. The presiding officer of such an event would have been Nelson Rockefeller. Vice President and President pro tem, I don't know if I'm saying that right, of the Senate. This particular resolution awaited in committee. Obviously, money would not be spent on these massive programs unless there would be the chance for the actual implementation of such a scheme. However, in the case the American people do not voluntarily adopt a new constitution, less troublesome to those who desire dictatorship, there is Executive Order 11490, which will include its predecessors when it is cited herein. The Executive Order authorizes the secretaries of the various agencies to prepare for any national emergency type situation, including but not limited to those specified in the Executive Order itself. If you read the order, there is nothing at all left to the imagination. For any conceivable pretense, a national emergency may be declared based upon this frightening decree. Dated October of 1969. The order itself was prefaced in March of 69 by another executive order, which established the federal regions and their capitals. All the departments of the government were involved, including the LEAA, Law Enforcement Assistant Administration, and the HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. Congressman Larry McDonald was revealed to Congress that various guerrilla and terrorist groups were being financed by the federal government. Surprising? No, not really. If they, the terrorist groups, actually began in certain activities, Executive Order 11490 would be activated. But as mentioned previously, if you will read Executive Order 11490, you will see that a national emergency may be declared for any conceivable pretense whatsoever. If the order itself were activated, here's what would happen. The next day, you and your family would be standing in front of your local post office with your neighbors, the front door bursting with block-long lines of people waiting to be registered. After waiting in line with your family for hours, you finally get channeled through the doors. Once inside, you overhear the postal clerk with his sidearm on, telling a frightened restraint, "Look, there is nothing I can do. The truck behind the building will take you to a work camp where you have been assigned. Your wife has been assigned to a factory, and there's nothing I can do." Then your son or daughter looks up at you with a quivering voice and asks, "Dad, why are we here?" On a side note, just to say, I worked at the post office for a little while, left pretty quick. I was reading this right before I started working at the post office, and so the post office has its own, basically every postmaster has their own little library inside of their main office, and none of the books are allowed to leave. They're all gigantic, thick, huge, gigantic chapter books, basically, on everything the post office is supposed to be about, be doing, etc., except for the fact that no one's allowed to read them without the postmaster general saying you can, and no one's allowed to take them out of the office, and the only way you can read them is to get approved by the postmaster general of that station, and they have to sit in the room with you to read them because they're not allowed to leave, they're not allowed to be copied, they're not allowed to be anything. So, just throwing that out there. Like, why would a mail company have literally a wall of basically encyclopedia thick, books on what their work is that no one's allowed to look at or read except for the postmaster unless the postmaster approves it, and then basically sits in the room with you because the postmaster has to be present, which the postmaster is practically never at a post office. They're always running around. They're all over the place. It's like, just consider that. I didn't get to read any of them because there was never time. There was never time to go in and be like, "Excuse me, postmaster, I want to read all of these thousands of books, and I'm not allowed to take them home and read them, and I'm not allowed to sit on the clock and read them, and you have to be in this room with me to read them." Like, it's set up to never be done, basically. So just think about that. Books that are not allowed to be read are normally books you need to read, Anyways, so implementing the new government. Well, you see, there's much more to life in a free country than paying your mortgage. You have to be aware of what is going on and act accordingly and participate in government. That is, get involved. Examining the organization chart on Executive Order 11490 to discover how we have all helped finance through our tax dollars. The mechanics of the overthrow of our Constitution, Executive Order 11490, designates certain authorities to the Office of Emergency Preparedness, which in turn designates authority to the various departments of the federal government. If order were implemented, the Post Office Department would be responsible for a national registration. The State Department would be responsible for the protection of the United Nations personnel or property and prevention of escape from the United States. The Department of Defense would be responsible for the expropriation of industry, I think I said that right, sorry, direction of services and national production system, control of censorship and communication expropriation of non-industrial facilities. The Commerce Department would be responsible for expropriation, selection, and international distribution of commodities, which would be the actual looting of the United States, Census Information, and Human Resources. The Treasury Department would be responsible for collection of cash and non-cash items and the recreation of evidence of assets and liabilities. The Justice Department would have concurrent responsibility with the Department of State of Prevention of Escape from the United States for replenishing the stockpile of narcotics for a national police force, for correctional and penal institutions for mass feeding and housing of prisoners, and for use of prisoners to augment manpower, which would be slave labor. The federal bank, which is not a federal bank, would be responsible for regulation of withdrawal of currency. The GSA, or General Services Administration, would be responsible for confiscation of private property for government use. Health, Education, and Welfare would be responsible for nationalization of education, which the Department of Education has already done. Health services, hospitals, and mental institutions. The Labor Department would be responsible for recruiting manpower, selecting manpower, referring manpower, and allocating manpower. So each particular person that was registered at the post office in this national registration would be told where he or she was going to work. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, would be responsible for transfer of persons to temporary or permanent housing and regional emergency planning and cooperation. The Transportation Department is responsible for emergency enforcement and control and movement of passengers and the emergency operation of the Alaska Railroad. There are two specific agencies here that we need to look at and to keep in mind. They are the HEW and the Justice Department. As those two agencies are related to the Department of Defense, the various military departments are part of the Department of Defense. Under it, we have the Secretary of Army, Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff of Personnel and Law Enforcement, U.S. Army's Forces Command, and Continental Army Reserve and National Guard. And under that, we have the four armies dividing up the United States. Under the Fifth Army, we have the Provost, I'm not sure how you say that, Marshal, who is directly connected to the Deputy Chief of Staff for law enforcement personnel. Under the Provost, I assume, Marshal, for the Fifth Army, we have the 300 Military Police Prison of War, or POW, Command at Livonia, Michigan. At this point, I quote from retired Administrator Elmo Zumwalt's book, On Watch. Kissinger states, "I believe the American people lack the will to do the things necessary to achieve parity, and to maintain maritime superiority. I believe we must get the best deal we can in our negotiations before the United States and the Soviets both perceive these changes and the balance that occurs. When these perceptions are in agreement and both sides know the U.S. is inferior, we must have gotten the best deal we can. Americans at that time will not be happy that I have settled for second, but it will be too late." Wonderful. What was that about Trump working with Russians? I believe in having presidents work with Russians way before him, And I mean, I don't really believe he was working with Russians. They already pretty much proved that didn't happen anyways, but even if he is, it's been going on way before him. He's not, uninvolved, relatively speaking. But anyways, so Zumwalt said, "Then why not take it to the American people? They will not accept the decision to become second best while we are in a position of gross national product twice that of the USSR. Kissinger responds, "That's a question of judgment. I judge that we will not get their support, and if we seek it and tell that fact, as we would have to do, we would lose our negotiation leverage with Soviets." Zumwalt stated, "But isn't that the ultimate immorality in a democracy, to make a decision for the people of such importance without consulting them?" Kissinger stated, "Perhaps, but I doubt that there are 1 million who could even understand the issue." Zumwalt responded, "Even if that presumption is correct, those 1 million can influence the opinions of the majority of the people. I believe it is my duty to take the other course." Kissinger responded, "You should take care lest your words result in a reduction in the Navy budget." So we see what the intention of the State Department is regarding the people. Another fact, on December 30th of 1975, the California National Guard announced in a press release, which I have, that the state's military police battalions were organized and trained to provide immediate response to virtually every civil and man-made disaster, as well as to assist law enforcement officers in emergency situations. To carry out their law enforcement as well as their military mission, when I asked 4 of the defendants in this case for their mission statement, they did not provide it, although they say it is public information. The training spoken of for the California National Guard covers such subjects as dealing with individual civilians, civil population, detention procedures, citizens' rights, and similar matters. And you know as well as I do that when there is martial law or martial rule, citizens have no rights, because the Constitution is preempted. Even the uniforms of the National Guards who participate in this program are different from the regular uniforms. Our Army spokesman will not reveal more about the uniforms, but the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department paramilitary units who have received this training also have Army fatigues dyed black for their uniforms. A further fact is the disaster preparedness plan for the Marine Corps Supply Center in Barstow, California. Quoting from that document, under the Constitution and the laws of the United States, the preservation of law and order is the responsibility of local and state government, and the authority to maintain the peace and enforce the law is invested in the authorities of those governments. There are specific exemptions to the above concept. One of these pertains to federal intervention to civil disturbances in certain situations. Military commanders are deemed to have the inherent authority to take any measure reasonably necessary for the protection of life and property in the event of a sudden, unexpected public calamity which disrupts the normal process of government and presents an emergency so imminent as to make it dangerous to await instructions from appropriate authorities. This includes law enforcement duties. The manual mentions something called garden plot forces, which we will discuss at length in a few minutes. Don Bell, who writes a weekly report, reported on July 25th of 1975 that in May of 1975, the 303 Civil Affairs Group of the U.S. Army Reserves in Kearney, New Jersey, conducted an exercise to sharpen plans for a military takeover of the state government in New Jersey. According to Colonel Francis Clark, they have conducted similar studies on how to seize municipal and county government over the past few years. But this was the first time they had studied state government. Such units were trained during World War II to operate captured governments in the foreign. We never had federal troops training to take over governments in the United States. When local violence or catastrophe struck, the National Guard, under command of the governor, went into action. This is definitely not the situation at this time. On February 16th of 1975, in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune, it was reported that the LEAA, funded by the Department of Justice, and the Police Foundation, funded by the Ford Foundation, are prime movers towards implementing a national public force. Each, however, contends they support local police agencies. The total program invoices military units that have the function of taking over the administration of local and state governments. That program is Operation Cable Splicer, by Army Civil Affairs Groups, a subplan of Operation Garden Plot, the martial law program. The method by which the national police concept is being presented to the public has changed. It was first disguised under the cover of protection against civil disturbances. This program was as follows: A. Keep the people from gathering in the streets. B. Isolate and neutralize the revolution's leadership. C. Dispersal of crowds and demonstrators. This is followed by a successful prosecution in order to 1. Validate the action of police, 2. Denying the arrestees propaganda materials, and 3. Denying them the opportunity to recover money damages against the police for arresting them. Let me quote for you the scenario which was developed by Cable Splicer 1, 2, and 3. To justify the needs for dealing with civil disturbances, Phase 1, an arrest and shooting provoke crowd unrest and threats against public officials, and a riot begins to form. Phase 2, police vehicles are ambushed, various attempted assassinations of public officials occur, destruction and raiding of armories occur, and thousands of people begin to gather, and local police lose control. Phase 3, increased movement of rioters, and the crowds must be dispersed before they become sympathetic with the rioters. The National Guard and the local police lose control. This scenario provides for an orderly transition from state to federal control. The Deputy Attorney General of California commented at a Cable Splicer 3 conference that anyone who attacks the state, even verbally, becomes a revolutionary and an enemy by definition. They are the enemy and must be destroyed. This program was taught in almost every state west of the Mississippi River and included as participants local active military, reserve military, and civilian police. The course name was Civil Emergency Management Course. The official explanation that was to be given, if any questions were asked about the program, was this activity is a continuous joint law enforcement military liaison effort and continuation of coordination established last year. In 1976, the Oakland Tribune carried the most complete explanation of what is planned. It is reported in entirety in the National Chronicle, which added an analysis of the story, to the story. The Oakland Tribune's editor died suddenly after the story was published. And I quote, "Last Saturday, this California National Guard unveiled a new law enforcement assistant force, LEAF, a special trained and outfitted military police unit whose members will serve as shock troops in the state's war against political protesters and demonstrators. I saw a full-dress exhibition of what the California National Guard has planned for the next American Revolution. Helicopters, SWAT teams, civilian military policemen in jackboots and helmets, 12-gauge shotguns, 38 and 45 caliber pistols, radios, walkie-talkies, and electronically controlled intelligence centers wired for instant communication with any police force in the state. LEAF is a 1,000-member unit put together this year to handle unique law enforcement problems such as mass civil disobedience, protest demonstrations, and riots. In other words, breaking heads and taking names. LEAF has the support of Governor Brown, a $250,000 worth of grants from the federal government, and no public opposition from civil liberties groups. For all its ineptitude, however, LEAF has a frightening possibility from a civil liberties standpoint. It is a direct product of the California Cable Splicer Conferences, a series of high-level secret meetings between government officials, law enforcement officers, and military planners, held during the late 60s and early 70s. These meetings were held as late as 1975, as far as any public records show. These were the conferences which Counter Spy magazine had identified as California's Garden Plot subplan. Gary Davis, Governor Brown's right-handed man, says LEAF is to assist civil police, not to replace them. Gary says civilians could expect a civilian-type law enforcement rather than what is commonly known as martial law. Despite this assurance, LEAF's exercises look disturbingly like the military coup described in the novel 7 Days in May. LEAF soldiers with nightsticks stood at intersections, stopping cars with suspicious occupants, checking ID cards, and generally intimidating onlookers with their SWAT-style uniforms, their sidearms, and helmets. Perhaps more ominously, several participants in the role-playing exercises Saturday admitted that, even under simulated pressure, there has already been a number of incidences where the Leaf troops use excessive force to quell disturbances even though their orders forbade it. End of quote. Former Leaf Administrator Charles Roscoven is on record as having stated that local law enforcement has failed and must be replaced by national police force. Patrick Murphy, the administrator of the Police Foundation, states, "I have no fear of a national police force. Our 40,000 police departments are not scared." Or, well, it says are not sacred. I think it's supposed to say are not scared, but either way. Ex-Attorney General William Saxby warned that if we can go on as we are, crime will invade us and the national police will take over. Isn't that nonsense? Sorry, okay. For the policemen who do not cooperate and still want to be policemen, there is the program of Contemporary Research, Inc. and organization of psychologists, sociologists, education specialists, and economic experts who work towards a solution of many of today's social problems. The same organization develops specialized computer programming for the new worldwide military command and control system, as well as computer-based systems for law enforcement agencies at all levels of government. The LEAA alone will receive over $1 billion a year over the next 4 years. Even though it has been ineffective against crime, this is because the LEAA is not geared to fighting crime, it's geared to developing a system for takeover of the United States with the assistance of the Department of Defense. The Plain Police State. One of the programs the LEAA works on in its fight against crime is psychosurgery. If you don't cooperate with their programs, you are merely operated on so that you be as cooperative as an adding machine. You can be as cooperative as an adding machine. Or the LEAA supports drug research for the same purpose, to neutralize neurological sources of violence. Hence, as an example, if a law were passed whereby the ownership of firearms was declared to be illegal, you would be placed in one of these programs if you do not cooperate. The LEAA control exercise at the state's level is from the Office of Criminal Justice Planning of the government's office. Here in Texas, Mr. Robert C. Flowers is still the executive director in that office, but all states have that particular department. In May of 1975, the LEAA newsletter describes the function of one of its organizations, the National Institute of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice. This organization funds something called the United Nations Clearinghouse in Rome, Italy. The function of that organization is, among other things, the exchange of criminal justice system information with the Soviet Union. And it goes without saying that we have nothing to learn from the criminal justice system of the Soviet Union. These incredible projects are being funded with our tax dollars. The code name for these projects are Garden Plot and Cable Splicer. Garden Plot is the program to control the population. Cable Splicer is the program for an orderly takeover of the state and local governments by the federal government. An investigation was completed in November in 1975 by 4 sources: the conservative publication American Challenge, the leftist New Times, the foundation-financed Fund for Investigative Journalism, and Don Wood of the trustworthy Ozark Sunbeam. It involves the potential creation of a police state through the use of the Pentagon and its computerized intelligence dossier lodged in the Pentagon basement, of thousands of citizens by the National Guard, state and local police departments, the LEAA, plainclothes military forces, SWAT teams, and the Department of Justice. Brig General J.L. Jelenic, senior Army officer of the Pentagon National Guard Bureau, has admitted, "I know of no state that did not have some form of these exercises within the last year." Today, the Cable Splicer Handbook is composed of 6 loose-leaf 3-ring binders that are merely an outline for the impending takeover and destruction of our Constitution. The 6th Army used the term Cable Splicer for the name of the operation, but it has not revealed the name of the operation in the other military areas within the U.S. On page 4, paragraph 10, on public information, the instructions state, as a means to prevent adverse publicity or misleading psychological effects in regard to coordinating, planning, and conducting this exercise, all military participants involved will perform such duties in civilian clothing. When exercise-oriented activities are conducted at law enforcement facilities, in the event inquiries are received regarding this exercise, the response should be limited to identifying the activity as a continuous joint law enforcement military liaison effort and a continuation of coordination established last year. On page 6, security guidance is explained to the effect that if anybody asks any questions, limit the information that is given out on the basis of it being in the interest of national interest or security. Now, in the festivities celebrating the success of completion of the exercises, General Stanley R. Larson, the commanding general of the 6th Army, stated, The most serious challenge facing all of us will be the challenge of discharging our legitimate responsibilities, for a significant portion of a society at large is likely to regard us with suspicion and to question, even challenge our authority on the basic assumption of our profession. Part of this challenge we must be prepared to deal with, a potentially dangerous portion of our society which, in truth, could well become the domestic enemy. The manual includes instructions on operation of confinement facilities, handling and processing prisoners, including searching, transporting, feeding, housing, and handling of the special class of persons called detainees. The plan also specifically includes a proposition for confiscation of privately owned weapons and ammunition. Files on potential prisoners. The Army has over 350 separate record centers containing substantial information on civilian political activities. Virtually every major Army unit has its own set aside from this. The 5th Army of San Antonio has over 100,000 files of its own. The overall Operation Command post is a domestic room at the Pentagon. There are 25 million cards on individuals and 760,000 on organizations held by the Defense Central Index of Investigations alone. And this information includes political, sociological, economic, and psychological profiles. All this type of information on 25 million Americans. Sorry. Okay, just go ahead and silence that since it keeps going off. Sorry. Okay, where was I? In 1970, local, county, and state police forces all over the country have undertaken crash programs to install various kinds of computerized information systems. A large portion of this is being paid for by the LEAA. Beginning in 1970, Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered the destruction of all these databanks, but they were not destroyed. All the outlawed collection is now located in Mount Weather, Clark County, West Virginia, and similar Pentagon facilities designed as adjuncts to the President's emergency powers under the executive orders. The cadre of specialized persons to enforce this plan are found in the U.S. Army Reserve's Military Police POW Command at Livonia, Michigan. Mr. Finneran of the 300th Military Police POW Command at Livonia told me when I called him from the Federal Information Center at Houston that the camps in the command were for foreign prisoners of war and for enemies of the United States. I asked him if enemies of the United States included U.S. citizens. He became angry, wouldn't deny it, and referred me to a very sinister individual at the Army Reserve facility here at Houston, who I talked to, who explained to me that the prisoners were called inventory and internees. He would not deny that the camps were for U.S. citizens. I called the Pentagon, spoke with the defendant there, and then with the Provost Marshal for the 5th Army, and do you know what? Not one of these persons would deny that the system was for U.S. citizens. The Provost Marshal for the 5th Army, when I mentioned the names of all campsites, said, well, at least you've got that right. Smartass. The names of the detention facilities that I gave him were a list that I had acquired from the Ozark Sunbeam. That list of names was the same list of facilities designed under the old Detention Act of 1950 as emergency detention centers, but there was only one problem. That act was supposed to have been repealed in 1971. After some research, I found out what the problem was. One congressman, when the hearings were held for the repeal of the Emergency Detention Act, mentioned that there are 17 other bits of law that provided for the same thing. So it didn't matter whether they ever repealed the Emergency Detention Act. The public was, in fact, tricked by the Congress of the United States. Here are the designated sites. Tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains of central Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, is a bustling town of approximately 10,000 people. 15 to 20 years ago, it was a sleepy village of 400. Allenwood, Pennsylvania, is linked to New York City by Interstate 80. It takes up approximately 400 acres and is surrounded by a 10-foot barbed wire fence. It now holds approximately 300 minimum security prisoners to keep it in shape. It could hold 12,000 people from one day to the next. 30 miles from Oklahoma City on US 66 is El Reno, Oklahoma, with an approximate population of 12,000. Due west 6 miles from town, almost in sight of US 66, is a complex of buildings which could pass for a small school. However, the facility is overshadowed by a guardhouse which appears to be something like an airport control tower, except that it's manned by a vigilant, uniformed guard. There is a federal prison camp or detention center. These camps are all located near superhighways or near railroad tracks, or both. Not surprising. The federal prison at Florence, Arizona, could hold 3,500 prisoners. It is presently kept in condition by approximately 400 legally convicted prisoners. Wickenburg, Arizona, is famous for its municipal airport, which was once government-owned. It is now occupied by a private party. It is rumored to be capable of being taken back by the federal government without notice. Now, there are a couple other of these facilities which are probably existing under the same arrangements. This particular rumor of instant taking back without notice has existed for about 9 or 10 years. The only way it can actually be established is by looking at the local contract for the Wickenburg Municipal Airport itself and the parties that have possession of it. As I mentioned previously, these names were ratified by the Provost Marshal of the Fifth Army, who was in charge of the 300th Military Police POW Command. He is the one who verified them. He said, as I mentioned before, well, at least you've got that right. Some of the other locations are Tool Lake in California, now in private hands. It can be retaken without notice. Some of the others, we have Mill Point, West Virginia. I couldn't find a thing on Mill Point, but in that area we have all kinds of prisons. Among them are Alderson, West Virginia, a women's federal reformatory, Lewisburg, West Virginia, a federal prison, Greenville, South Carolina, and Greenville County is now occupied by the State Youthful Offenders Division. Even that is a mystery to the people of the area. At Montgomery, Alabama, we have a federal civilian prison camp at, sorry, I have a marker on here, at Maswell Air Force Base. Now, does that sound right? There's one at Tucson, Arizona, David Munson Air Base. In Alaska, we have Elmendorf at Eielson Air Force Base. And that brings us to a facility in Florida called Avon Park, Florida. I sent a representative to see what was at Avon Park. He found the Avon Park Bombing and Gunnery Range, which is also listed as the 56th Combat Support Squadron of the U.S. Air Force, which is also listed as the Avon Park Correctional Institute. No one is permitted entrance, and probably there is no overfly permitted because it is a bombing and gunnery range. This was one of the places ratified by the Provost Marshal of the Fifth Army. In 1976, as well as on March 20th, 1979, I went to the Sheriff's Department in Houston to see if our local Sheriff's Department had been infiltrated by these plans. Well, it appears so. I was put in contact with Lieutenant Kilgen, who is in charge of some secret unit in the military, some secret unit in the department, I asked him if he had participated in military training or in training with military personnel here in the Sheriff's Department. He denied it, and when I asked him if he would testify, so under oath, he became angry and stated, "You're just an ordinary citizen. I don't have to tell you anything." I later discovered that Lieutenant Kilgen is the ex-director of the Houston branch office of the U.S. Secret Service. Now, where does his money come from? The area is administered by the Houston Galveston Area Council. In this regional government plan, each federal region is divided into state clearinghouses, and each state clearinghouse is divided into area clearinghouses. And for our area, we have the Houston Galveston Area Council. It serves as a conduit for federal funds in two major areas, LEAA and HEW. Most everybody thinks this organization, the Houston Galveston Area Council, is for the development of the area, the geographical area here in Houston, but it is not. It is for the development of LEAA and HEW projects. Now, this finds its counterparts in every community across the U.S. It provides for those agencies, liaison for intergovernmental communications, interaction, and coordination, mental cooperation, and takeover plans. I examined their projects to see what they were doing. These regional government program distributes federal funds for two major purposes. One, radio hookups between every police agency in the state for Sam Houston, and two, mental health programs, including programs for the mentally ill, having priority of beds in hospitals. Another interesting fact to consider is that in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Arsenal B to Z is stored. It's a nerve gas which creates sleepiness, dizziness, stupor, and the incapacity to move about. According to the Associated Press, the agent can be sprayed by aerosol, injected or sprayed over large areas by a bomb. The military has admitted that one potential use of the gas is for civilian control. So whatever they have planned, they've also planned a way for you to go to your destination in a tranquil state of mind. I wouldn't doubt that that's part of the chemtrails going on, because everybody's partly retarded these days, but here nor there. HEW by law is operated in conjunction with the United Nations through the World Health Organization. Back in 1948, the International Congress on Mental Health, a UN organization, declared in its pamphlet, Mental Health and World Citizenship, that prejudice, hostility, or excessive nationalism may become deeply embedded in the developing personality without awareness on the part of the individual concerned. In order to be effective, efforts of changing individuals must be appropriate to the successive stages of the unfolding personality. While in case of a group of society, change will be strongly resisted unless an attitude of acceptance has first been engendered. Principles of mental health cannot be successfully furthered in any society unless there is a progressive acceptance of the concept of world citizenship. This document states, programs for social change to be effective require a joint effort of psychiatrists and social scientists, working together in cooperation with statesmen, administrators, and others in positions of responsibility. The three phases of the development are 1. Mental hospitals for segregation, care, and protection of persons of unsound minds. 2. Community mental health care centers so that persons may be treated in their own neighborhoods. And 3. Child care centers for dealing with early difficulties of nationalism in a child's life. 2 years earlier, Major General G.B. Chisholm, Deputy Minister of Health in Canada, who later became Director of United Nations World Health Organization, explained, self-defense may involve a neurotic reaction when it means defending one's own excessive material wealth from others who are in great need. This attitude leads to war. So his solution to the problem is, let's redistribute the wealth among everybody. Further, the reinterpretation and eventual eradication of the individual's concept of right and wrong, which has been the basis of child training, are the belated objectives of practically all effective psychotherapies. Now, if we digress even further to Beria, the director of the Soviet secret police in the 1930s, we see that he explained the communist political strategy through the use of mental healings of psychiatry. Psychopolitics is the art and science of asserting and of maintaining a dominion over the thoughts and loyalties of individuals, officers, bureaus, and masses, and the effecting of the conquest of enemy nations through mental healing. You must work, he stated, until every teacher of psychology unknowingly or knowingly teaches only communistic doctrine under the guise of psychology. What are we looking at right now, guys? What are we looking at right now? Anyways, if you look at the Russian Manual of Instruction of Psychopolitical Warfare, we see in Chapter 9, psychopolitical operations should at all times be alert to the opportunities to organize for the betterment of the community's mental health centers. Now, under the new National Mental Health Program at this moment, there are more than 600 of these community mental health centers across the United States. The whole thing was promoted by Dr. Stanley F. Yoles, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in 1969. And he stated back then that the newest trend in treating mental illness is care at local health care centers where the patient is not isolated from his or her family and friends. They have been working on this program for 46 years publicly and now across the U.S. Through your tax dollars, you have 603 centers, to be exact, community health centers that are all part of this program. And this is how they are part of the program. It has already happened. In the mid-1950s, there was set into motion an interesting chain of events. About 1956, the Alaskan Mental Health Bill was proposed and later passed. It granted approximately $12 million and 1 million acres of public land to Alaska so that it could develop its own mental health program. Now, this was a little abnormal since Alaska only had over 400 people who were classified as mentally ill. And this is how they are part of the program. I already said that. After the bill was passed, Alaska passed its own, enabling legislation to get into the mental health business. They started by adopting the essential elements of the Public Health Service Draft Act on the hospitalization of the mentally ill and the old Interstate Compact on Mental Health, now called the Uniform Mental Health Act. There was no provisions for jury trial in it or anything else. You would just be picked up and taken to the Alaskan Siberian Asylum incommunicado, and the state would also confiscate all your personal and real property, and they actually tried to do it in 1954 in the case of Ford versus Milenak, which declared the act as adopted in another state, the state of Missouri, as unconstitutional. The act itself still exists, but modified. Essentially, in the same form, the Uniform Mental Health Act, to which approximately 6 states subscribes, and in passing, mute state constitutions. If you will check them for the period of 1935, they made a part of the Constitution the practice of having a person submit to a 90-day mental examination to determine his or her sanity. Without any provisions for a trial by jury, this was part of the national program at that time. In this act, the governor could have anyone picked up and sent to the mental health institution in Alaska or elsewhere. The results, as rumors back in the 1950s, were that there was, in fact, a sinister Frankenstein-type mental health prison in Alaska. I wrote to Alaska, the officials that is, and asked them for a description of the land of 1 million acres that they were eligible to receive under the Alaskan Mental Health Act. And I also asked them for a copy of the inventory they ran for their facilities back at the same time. Well, so far, no answer. And probably I will never receive an answer without a court order. But through the years, there was a spot in Alaska that was continually referred to: southeast of Fairbanks, southwest of Fairbanks, northwest of Fairbanks, somewhere near Fairbanks. Then I received information that a pilot had flown over the area once and had had his license revoked. And so for $1.85 each, I ordered the low-level navigation maps from the federal government for Alaska and located the Alaska Siberian Asylum for the treatment of enemies of the United States. It's right where rumor over the past 20 years had placed it, southeast of Fairbanks. It stands out like a sore thumb. It's the only one of that geometric configuration within the state of Alaska, and you will note a black line running up through Fairbanks and down over near that area of the map. That is the railroad that the Department of Transportation would take the emergency operation of under the executive order. If the executive order went into effect, an HEW would be responsible for making a determination of whether or not you were mentally disturbed because of your nationalistic tendencies, your love for the United States, or your adherence to any political or religious doctrine. But let's look a little further into the type of program that the LEAA is paying for through the Department of Justice. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, located in the backwoods of North Carolina near a tiny village called Butner, is constructing a mammoth 42-acre research complex for prisoners from throughout the East, who will be sent for experiments to test new behavioral programs and techniques. Target date for completion of the entire system is, ironically, 1984. Wonderful, guys. And so they're using, right now, under the LEAA program, something called Anactin. Punishment for troublesome behavior within the prison is being done by drugs and shock. Likely to be the most selected examples of programs that have made use of Anactin, a derivative of South American curari, C-U-R-A-R-I, I'm not sure how you say that. Anactin was originally used as a beginning factor to electroconvulsive shock. Such shocks applied to the head are so strong that they can break and graze bones under the strain of resulting muscle contractions. Since Anactin paralyzed the muscles without dampening consciousness or the ability to feel pain, by first injecting the inmates with it, researchers can turn up the voltage as high as they want without cracking the inmate's skeleton when his body is thrown into convulsions by the jolt. Great. What the Anactin does, in short, is simulate death within 30 to 40 seconds of injection. It brings on paralysis first, with the small, rapidly moving muscles in the nose, fingers, and eyes, and then in the diaphragm and the cardiovascular system. As a result, the patient cannot move or breathe and yet remains fully conscious, as though drowning and dying. This is from the 1974 publication Human Behavior. The People versus the Conspirators. The federal government answered my suit in June 1976 by filing an unsworn general denial of everything that I had alleged. I spoke with the assistant U.S. attorney in charge of the case and asked him if he had gone to the trouble to call any of the parties mentioned in the suits, since I had provided not only addresses but their telephone numbers to provide a faster means of investigation. He said he had not. He had not even done a minimal amount of investigation of the cases, but yet he filed a denial of my allegations. I filed a motion in the meantime to make the deposition of the person who writes the training programs for the concentration camp guards, Mr. Richard Barrage, the 75th Maneuver Air Command at Army Reserve Center at Houston, Texas, stating, in the light of all the recent activity of government agents, one of the agencies involved might attempt to murder this key witness, the author of the training camp program. The federal judge denied my motion, stating that I had not quoted enough cases to him justifying my request. However, he was also aware that there were no cases existing on this set of facts, but as you will see as I go along with this report, he chose to ignore it. I then made an agreement with the assistant U.S. attorney to take the deposition of Mr. Barrage after I'd made the arrangements. The U.S. attorney refused to voluntarily go along with taking the deposition. It is very difficult to find justice in our system of courts. Law is usually practiced by the buddy system, hence the court rules are overlooked or not followed. On July 29th, the hearing was held at the Magistrate of Normal Black U.S. District Court in Houston. The courtroom was completely filled with spectators, and although the news media had been contacted, no representatives of the press were there. There is a new media blackout on this matter here in Houston. Brief oral arguments were presented. The U.S. attorney explained that I was not the proper person to bring the suit because, although the free exercise of my constitutional rights was threatened by the concentration camp program, as alleged, it did not constitute my injury. The magistrate was impressed with the information I had thus far collected and stated that he would bring it to the attention of the federal judge. The U.S. attorney tried to have my investigation of the case halted, but the magistrate would not go along that far with the prearranged decision. As an additional indication of what I was up against, the original hearing was scheduled for 10:30 in the morning. However, the U.S. attorney secretly had the time changed to 2:30 in the afternoon. The magistrate gave the U.S. attorney permission to file for motion to dismiss because he felt that the concentration camp program to be used for persons who exercise their freedom of speech did not present any injury. Now, on July 23rd, I had placed in the Houston Post and in the Houston Chronicle newspapers the following advertisement in the legal section. Solicitation for Witnesses in Civil Action 78-H-667, Federal District Court of Houston, People X. Rel. William Papps versus Gerald Ford, the action titled Complaint Against the Concentration Camp Program of the Department of Defense. Attention, if you have participated in Operation Garden Plot, Operation Cable Splicer, the 300th Military Police Prisoner of War Command, or the Army Reserve Civil Affairs Group, you may be involved in a program that needs to be disclosed for this suit. To give your testimony, call or write, and then I place my name, address, and telephone number. As I previously mentioned, there's a news media blackout on the story here in Houston. Both newspapers refused to carry the ad. First at the Houston Post, I had to threaten them with a lawsuit to carry out the ad, even though I was paying for it, and then at the Houston Chronicle. I had to meet with the president and various vice presidents because of a refusal from that paper had come up from their own lawyers. Both newspapers finally carried it, but only after 2 days of complaining. The initial response of both papers was, "We don't carry stories like that, and don't you think that the people planning the concentration camps have our best interest in mind?" As you will hear for yourselves, the policies definitely do not reflect our interests, or our best interests, sorry. The next event that occurred was that the U.S. attorney filed a statement of authority showing the reasons that he could find why I should not be allowed to take depositions to get more information from the persons who was writing the concentration camp guard training program. However, his brief was completely filled with misquotes of the law from many cases. He would mention the case and then invent whatever the case should say. In my brief to the court at this point, I notified the judge of the violation of the law requiring honesty in such matters, but the notification was ignored by the judge, who apparently sanctioned this most dishonest of acts commonly known as quoting out of context. The Geneva Convention. My brief was filed on August 31st. Formal arguments were set. The new courtroom of the magistrate was almost filled again. However, no one from the news media showed up for this hearing either. The few who were contacted had been told not to go because they would lose their jobs. At the hearing, I introduced evidence that heretofore had never been introduced in any court of law in the U.S. The U.S. attorney had denied, "You remember everything in my suit without so much as even a tiny investigation." So I introduced into evidence the following letter from the Department of Army, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff of Personnel, signed by one B. Sergeant Colonel G.S., Acting Director of Human Resources Development. The letter states, "On behalf of President Ford, I am replying to your letter 27th of May, 1976, regarding a new article in the Dallas Morning News. As much as he would like to, the President cannot reply personally to every communication he receives. Therefore, he has asked the departments and agencies of the federal government in those instances where they have special knowledge or special authority underlogged. For this reason, your communication was forwarded to officials of the Department of Defense. Within the Department of Defense, the Army is responsible for custody and treatment of enemy prisoners of war and civilian internees as defined under terms of the Geneva Convention of 1949. Therefore, the Army is prepared to detain prisoners of war and detainees as defined in Article 1V, that's I think 5 in Roman numerals, I can never remember Roman numerals, of the 1949 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war and protection of civilian persons. It is U.S. policy that its armed forces adhere to the provisions of international law to set the example for other countries of the world to follow and respecting the rights and dignity of those who become victim of international conflict. It should be noted that the Army program is designed for implementation during conditions of war between the U.S. and one or more foreign countries. The Army had no plans, nor does it maintain detention camps to imprison American citizens during domestic crisis. The problem with this letter is that it's not true, and that's why I'm going to discuss it at this point. First of all, in verifying the authenticity of the claims in the letter, I checked the Geneva text. There is no article in the Geneva Convention entitled as the letter states. There is, however, on each one of the classifications, protection of war victims, civilian persons, and a separate article on prisoners of war. That was the first discrepancy. Then I turned to Article 1V of the Geneva Convention. That article did not set up any requirements or authorizations for military units of any type and does not even suggest it, hence the second discrepancy. The next problem with the letter from President Ford's representative is that it states that the Prisoner of War Guard program is set up for the implementation for conditions of war between the U.S. and one or more foreign countries. However, Article 3 of the Geneva Convention reads that the treaty applies to, and I'm quoting, "in case of an armed conflict, not of an international character, occurring within the territory of one of the high contracting parties." Obviously, an armed conflict occurring within one's own territory did not mean between one or more of the parties to the treaty, especially if only one is involved. Now, the examples of this type of conflict are civil war, armed insurgency, and guerrilla activities. In other words, they're speaking of a domestic conflict. An even more shocking item is found on the last page of the 1949 Geneva Convention under Protection of War Victims, Civilians, Persons. You will find the index card, the identification card, forms to be used to writing to your family, and everything necessary for the administration of a concentration camp is contained in this treaty that the U.S. signed and ratified. Further, if there is a conflict in the U.S. involving only the U.S., this convention or treaty can go into operation, which includes the procedures for setting up concentration camps. Article LXV 111 of the convention states, and I paraphrase, if you commit an offense that is solely intended to harm the occupying power, not harming the life or limb of members of the occupying power, but merely talking against such a force, such as martial law situation, you can be imprisoned provided that the duration of such imprisonment is proportionate to the offense committed. Well, President Dwight Eisenhower didn't feel that provisions were strong enough, so he had the following additions placed in the treaty, which states, the U.S. reserves the right to impose the death penalty in accordance with the provisions of Article XLV 111, without regarding to whether the offenses referred to therein are punishable by death under the law of the occupied territory at the time the occupation begins. So, not only can you be imprisoned for having exercised freedom of speech, you can be put to death under the provisions of the Geneva Convention in 1949 for having exercised or attempting to exercise freedom of speech. It's pretty close to what we're seeing right now. The next item that I introduced into evidence was a field manual, F.E.M.A 41-10, Civil Affairs Operation. You remember at the outset that I mentioned civil affairs groups. Let me quote to you from the manual from what one of the functions of the civil affairs activities includes. Item 4, assumption of full or partial executive, legislative, and judicial authority over a country or area. So let's see what a country or area is defined as in the same manual. It includes small towns and rural areas, municipalities of various population sizes, districts, counties, provinces, states, regions of national government. Nowhere in the manual does it exclude this program from being put into effect right here in the United States. As a matter of fact, in Kearney, New Jersey, the Civil Affairs Group went into that area and practiced taking over that government unit. And yet the Army, in its letter of June 16th, states that these programs are not for us, yet they are practiced here in the United States under conditions that can only occur here at home. The study outlined a field manual F.E.M.A 41-10 on page J24 under Penal Institutions 1-B. You see there is a program on concentration camps and labor camps, number, location, and capacity. It is important to note that a concentration camp and labor camp are always located near each other for obvious reasons. Typo. Again, on page D4 of the same manual, you'll find a sample receipt for seized property. A sample receipt written English and containing terminology applicable to U.S. territory. To only U.S. territory, sorry. On page 8-2 of the same manual, under the heading Tables of Organizations and Equipment, we find that there are 3 other organizations that would be working along with the Civil Affairs Operation: the Chemical Service Organization, the Composite Service Organization, the Psychological Operations Organization, along with the various Civil Affairs organizations. In July of that year, 1976, the following civil affairs groups met with the following airborne groups at a staging area in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. A staging area is where military units meet before they go into action. They meet with the 32nd Airborne and part of the 101st Airborne, the 321st Civil Affairs Group of San Antonio, Texas headquarters, the 362nd Civil Affairs Brigade from Dallas, Texas, the 431st Civil Affairs Company from Little Rock, Arkansas headquarters, and the 306th Civil Affairs Group in William Highland, the 486th Civil Affairs Company from Tulsa, Oklahoma, the 418th Civil Affairs Company from Kansas City, Missouri, the 307th Civil Affairs Group from St. Louis, Missouri, the 490th Civil Affairs Group from Abilene, Texas, the 413th Company from Hammond, Louisiana, the 12th SS Group, and 2nd Battalion, headquarters unknown. They're ready to go into action. The problem is, as it appears, they were ready to take over the entire government of the United States as their mission set out. One man who attended the staging area talked to a civil affairs sergeant and asked him what his job was. The sergeant explained that the civilians of this country will really be surprised someday when the civil affairs groups begin to operate the government. Now, the Department of the Army still maintains that all this is not for the United States, yet this training continues here for us. The evidence is overwhelming. The plan exists for the imprisonment of millions of U.S. citizens, and even though all this information was presented to the federal magistrate, he still felt that no one was injured by such a plot. On the second day of September 1976, the magistrate recommended to the federal judge that the case be dismissed, and the sole basis for his reasoning to dismiss was that we have to be actually physically injured before we can maintain a lawsuit of this type. He did not feel that, although all this active planning, preparation, and training was going on, that any U.S. citizen had been injured, even though the citizen may fear exercising his or her freedom for fear of being detained and imprisoned in a concentration camp at a later date. Ignoring the Constitution. The case of Tatum versus Laird, heard before the Supreme Court in 1974, is a case in point. It involved the Army intelligence collecting apparatus, which was developing a list of names of persons who the Army felt were troublesome. The Supreme Court held that the making of lists of this type did not, of and by itself, present any injuries. The minority opinion in this case was that the injury, in the case with a program such as this, made people afraid to use their freedom of speech for fear of being sent to jail for it. The majority did not buy that argument. The difference between the case and this case, although we also have the computer program, is that we have something much further past that point. The concentration camp guard program and the civil affairs program for taking over all functions of our government. In light of that, the federal judge said that this is not an injury. As a matter of fact, the U.S. attorney alleged that even if people were placed in concentration camps, if they were all treated the same way, they would still not have the right to go to federal court. On the 20th day of September, I filed a memorandum to notify the magistrate and the federal judge that I had discovered that the federal government had a program for a number of years to suspend our constitutional right of the writ of habeas corpus. This information substantiated that complaint. Habeas corpus is the name of the legal instrument utilized to bring someone before a judge when that person is being illegally imprisoned or detained so that he or she may obtain his or her freedom. The Constitution states that the writ of habeas corpus shall never be suspended. I found the disturbing information in Report 94-755, the 94th Congress, Second Session Senate, April 26 of 1976, entitled Intelligence Activities and the Rights of Americans, Book 2. On page 17D, entitled First Amendment Rights, and the report states that, more importantly, the government surveillance activities in the aggregate, whether expressly intended to do so, to deter the exercise of First Amendment rights by American citizens who become aware of the government's domestic intelligence program. Beginning on page 54, it stated that beginning in 1946, 4 years before the Emergency Detention Act of 1950 was passed, the FBI advised the Attorney General that it had secretly compiled a secret index of potentially dangerous persons. The Justice Department then made tentative plans for emergency detention based on suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. Department officials deliberately avoided going to Congress. When the Emergency Detention Act of 1950 was passed, it did not authorize the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, but shortly after passage of that act, according to a Bureau document, Attorney General J.H. McGrath told the FBI to disregard it and to proceed with the program as previously outlined. A few sentences later, on page 55, it states, with the security index, use broader standards to determine potential dangerous than those described in the statute. And unlike the act, department plans provided for issuing a master search warrant and a master arrest warrant. This is the center importance. It is the same thing that I am alleging in federal court, and yet the magistrate chose to ignore these facts also. We have government officials not only ignoring the will of Congress, but going the opposite of what the Constitution provides by planning illegally for the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. In addition, as mentioned before, the master search warrant and the master arrest warrant are forms fed into the computer which print the names and addresses on them from the tapes previously prepared by the intelligence gathering program. As you are arrested, your home will be searched and anything found there may be confiscated. This program has existed since 1946, up to and including 1973, and without proper access to judicial discovery techniques, it can't be determined whether the plan now exists under the same name or under another name right now. This memorandum was filed on September 28th to make the court aware of the danger that our rights of freedom of speech and lawful assembly are in. But the court, on September 30th, after this notification was received, dismissed the case. However, in keeping with the practice of federal courts in Houston of actively participating in the obstruction of justice, I was not notified of the dismissal until the 6th of October, which gave me just 2 working days to submit any further motion in a 10-day period before time starts running for the appeal. What I have just said regarding the federal courts in Houston is not only my opinion. The Houston Chronicle, surprisingly, published an extensive document severely criticizing the federal courts in Houston for making up their own rules as they go along with the proceedings, as well as commenting on the communist-like Supreme Court attitude of the judges and the court personnel. My experience here has been that the court has returned to me almost every document that I have filed. Then after a give argument, they re-accept the document stating that they just made a mistake. In reality, the power structure doesn't want these types of cases in any federal court. Let's see. Hold on, I gotta look at my time. Okay, perfect. So, summary of evidence. On the 8th of October, I had submitted a request for finding the facts and filing which had been established by the evidence presented. 1. The 300th Military Police POW Command is located at Livonia, Michigan. 2. The Department of the Army has stated that said command exists per se the Geneva Convention of 1949, a treaty of the U.S., Article 1 thereof under the title relative to the treatment of prisoners of war and protection of civilian persons. 3. However, no such title exists in the Geneva Convention per se. 4. Nevertheless, there are separate titles, one of which is A. Multilateral Protection of War Victims, Persons of War. B. Multilateral Protection of War Victims, Civilians, Persons. 5. Nevertheless, Article 1V of both titles does not provide for the creation of any military programs for concentration camps. 6. Whether Mr. Finneran of the 300th Military Police POW Command has stated that the purpose of the command is for the detention of foreign prisoners of war and enemies of the United States. 7. Further, Article 3 concerning civilian persons makes the treaty applicable to conflicts occurring solely within the territory of the United States that are not of an international conflict, which is capable of including any type of conflict in its description, whether it be civil war or guerrilla activity or anything else. The text states, in case of armed conflicts, not of any international character, occurring in the territory of one of the high contracting parties, each party to a conflict shall be bound to apply to the minimum of the following provisions. 8. Department of the Army Field Manual FM 4110, Civil Affairs Operations of Civil Affairs, Organization lists as one of its functions the assumption of full or partial executive, legislative, and judicial authority over a country or an area, and there is no specific inclusion of the United States as such a country or area. 9. Said manual defines country along certain geographical population basis, country, state, regions, and national government. 10. Said organization has, in fact, practiced takeovers of local and state governments in the continental U.S., including but not limited to the state of New Jersey. 11. Said organization includes in its study outline on page J24 a section on concentration camps and labor camps. 12. Said organization includes in its operations composite service operations and psychological operation organizations. 13. Said psychological operations working with the U.S. Public Health Service is prepared to operate any and all mental health facilities in the United States as tools of repression against outspoken but nonviolent political conduct of United States citizens in conjunction with all of the above, which is to be used for the same purpose. 14. Further, the Department of Justice is in conjunction with this program has had plans for the suspension of writ of habeas corpus since the year of 1946. Said plan depriving persons being detained under this total program any means for protection against tyrannical political repression. The plaintiff requested that the court make findings of fact and draw conclusions of law, consistent therewith as shown by the evidence on record before further consideration. I mentioned that it appeared that all this planning for concentration camps was to be directed against anyone, regardless of his political persuasion or ideology, who exercised freedom of speech against the established power structure of international bankers and multinational corporations. But with Proposition 13 type movements threatening to reduce taxes throughout our nation, I foresee an activation of emergency programs so that the parasites on the federal take will continue to receive their checks. Price of patriotism. In the same Senate document on intelligence, activities on the rights of Americans referred to on page 166 and 167, you will find that the federal government has targeted its intelligence activities against one group of Americans. On page 166, the first classification listed its listed its rightist and anti-communist groups, and the first group on page 167 on Army surveillance lists the John Birch Society as number 1 and the Young Americans for Freedom as the number 2 target. Therefore, the groups of U.S. American citizens considered to be the biggest enemies of the United States by the federal government at this time is the conservative patriot and those who assert the Constitution and individual rights. Sound familiar? Although this information has been available since April of this year, 1979, no one has mentioned this incredible discovery that the federal government considers the patriotic conservative as its greatest enemy. I've received all kinds of information regarding this case from all across the United States. Price of apathy. I obtained the 1945 report of the OSS Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA, 7th Army William W. Quinn, Colonel GFC AC of the G2, on the liberation of Dachau, I might have said that really wrong, a concentration camp during the liberation in Germany. It contains much groups of information, but the relevant portion of the report concerns itself with the section on the town's people. Quoting from this report on why the people of this little town didn't complain or didn't overthrow oppressors, but just continued to go along and get along even though they lost their freedom in the process. It states, these words crop up and up again. They are the rationalization of a man who admits that he was a member of the Nazi Party. I was forced to do so by business reasons, they state. We were lied to in every respect, but they admit they knew the camp existed. But they saw the work detailed to the inmates passing through the streets under guard, and in some instances the SS behaved brutally even towards the townspeople. When asked if they realized that within the last 3 months before the liberation, 13,000 men lost their lives within stone's throw of where the people lived, they claimed they were shocked and surprised. When asked if they never saw transports of dead and dying pass through the streets along the railway, they referred only to the last one. They insist that most of the trains came in at night and they were sealed cars. Did they never ask what was in the endless procession of cars that came in full and always went out empty? A typical reply was, we were told it was all army material and booty from France. It is established that anyone who stated that he saw only one train come in the daytime was telling a flat lie. There are quite a few such people in Dachau. The analysis of the anti-Nazi element of the town. 1, the people knew what was going on in the camp even 10 years prior to liberation. 2, the town did a thriving business from the concentration camp guard. 3, 99% are guilty and have dabbed themselves with the blood of innocent human beings. 4, the people are to blame for their cowardice. They were all too cowardly. They didn't want to risk anything, and that was the way it was in all of Germany. So you can see how the whole program is related to here. My lawsuit was against one single aspect of the total program, the enforcement arm of the conspiracy. The people who make up the cadre that is going to occupy the concentration camps were enemies of the United States and will be placed. Remember, Solzhenitsyn's words, I probably said that terribly wrong, in the Gulag Archipelago. Resistance should have began right there, but it did not begin. You aren't gagged, you really can, and you really ought to cry out that arrests are being made on the strength of false accusations. If many such outcries had been heard all over the city, would arrests have no longer been so easy? They, the tyrants, can't work in the public eye. Those people who were so apathetic, hoping that nothing was really wrong, that nothing would happen to their persons and property, sat back and watched. The anarchists, financed by multinational interests, looted and pillaged their country. Oh, does that not sound familiar? If you think that all that is necessary to pay your house notes, to pay your TV notes, to go to vote when there is an election, and to stand back during the rest of the year and watch as your country and way of life are replaced by a system in which you will be a slave in a concentration camp, you, not the conspirators, are guilty because you, by silent acquisition, invite tyranny and oppression. And when you have to steal food to eat because our production is for foreign use, because the Department of Commerce, through Executive Order 11490 and its predecessors, is responsible for international distribution of our commodities, don't sit in a covert hiding and eating and sondering what happened because you made it all possible. When your family is split up and spread across the United States to do slave labor and you never see your loved ones again, it will be your fault because you did nothing to prevent it. And once we lose our freedom, we are never going to regain it. That is why we must stand together to prevent the loss of our freedom as citizens of the United States. Thank you very much. Bill Cooper. I mean, really, that's chapter 6 for you guys. Look around. What's happening right now? The exact same thing. Oh, it's ridiculous. Anyways, guys, sorry it took a while to get this out. I will get chapter 7 and 8 out within a couple of days because they're both really short. Hope you're enjoying. Have a good day.